And in this module, we're going to look at how to deploy our ASP.NET MVC application. So we're going to learn about all those little details that we need to know in order to take our application from running locally on our machine in development to a real web server, perhaps directly to a production server or maybe a test and QA server first. And like everything in software, there are different approaches that you can take to deploying ASP.NET. I'm just going to show you one approach using Visual Studio, but if you work for an organization or a larger team, your company might already have a build and deployment process set up for you, perhaps using a tool like Azure DevOps. If you are curious how Azure DevOps works, that's a topic I cover in my Azure for .NET Developers course. In this module, in this course, we're going to use Visual Studio, and even with Visual Studio, I have options on how and where I deploy my application. One option with Visual Studio is to publish our application to Iis directly. Iis being Internet Information Services. This is the web server for Microsoft Windows and Microsoft Windows Server. And in development with Visual Studio, we've been using a lightweight version of Iis known as Iis Express. In this module, we will use the full version of Iis that I have installed on my machine. But I do want to point out that this technique works with both local and remote machines. So as long as I have the right permissions and credentials, I can use Visual Studio to publish to Iis running on a machine somewhere else on my network. And I can also publish my app to, let's say, a virtual machine running in the cloud. Again, all we need is permissions and connectivity so Visual Studio can talk to the right components on other machines over the network. Another option for publishing is to publish to an Azure App Service. App services are a great managed platform for hosting web apps and web APIs. If you're interested in using app services, my Getting Started with Azure course can walk you through everything that you need to know. And yet a third option is to use Visual Studio to publish the application to a file system. This option gives me a folder on the file system with all the files that I need to deploy into production. So with these files, I can create an archive, a zip file, and I can copy these files to a network share for someone else, like some administrator, to take and deploy to production. There's a lot of flexibility here because you'll have all the files that you need in one place, and then you or someone else can move them into a server in a location for Iis, and you can use other tools and other people in your organization to do that. And this is actually the approach I want to show you. I'm going to publish to the file system and then show you how to point Iis to that location on the file system. And if you want to follow along, you are going to need to make sure that you have the right software installed. So let's look at that next. Two pieces of software that you'll need to have installed to follow along. The first is a new version of Sql Server. Why is that? Well, we did see in this course how easy it is to use Microsoft SQL Server, the LocalDB version. LocalDB is a version of SQL Server that gets installed by Visual Studio, and it's very easy to use in development. Unfortunately, when it comes to running a real web application in production in a real web server like Iis, there's some difficulties getting LocalDB and Iis to work together. Because Iis, being a real web server, runs as a Windows service in a privileged context, whereas LocalDB, being a development database, is a process that runs with my credentials and not as a service, and the two are just going to have trouble communicating. Yes, you will find some blog posts and articles on how to get SQL Server, LocalDB, and Iis to work together, but I've taken what I think is a simpler and easier approach, and that is to install a version of SQL Server that will work well and easily with Iis. It is still a free version of SQL Server, so if you do a search for SQL Server Download, you should be able to come to the SQL Server Downloads page, and if you scroll down, you will find a free specialized edition of SQL Server. In fact, there's two different editions that are free. The first, the one I have installed already on this machine, is Sql Server Developer. Sql Server Developer comes with all the features of Sql Server. It's just not licensed for production use. But as long as you're using this edition of Sql Server for testing and development, then you'll be just fine. And this is what I have installed. And because this version of Sql Server runs as a service in a privileged context, much like Iis does, the two have an easier time communicating together. Another option, if you want a slightly lighter weight version of Sql Server, is to download and install Sql Server Express. In fact, LocalDB is simply a lighter weight version of Sql Server Express. The difference being that LocalDB only works for me, the developer, whereas SQL Server Express, it still works as a service, and it's something that you can use even in production as long as you have a small data set. So it does have restrictions on how large a database can grow. Once you have one of these SQL Server editions installed, you should be able to come into Visual Studio and reach your new instance of SQL Server. So for example, I already have SQL Server Developer Edition installed. So let me go to the View menu, and I want to go again to the SQL Server Object Explorer. It is here where we established a connection to MS SQL LocalDB, and that allowed us to see that we were in fact creating our Ode to Food MVC database inside of this SQL Server instance. But now I want to connect to a different instance of SQL Server that is running on my local machine, and it is not SQL Server LocalDB. It's SQL Server. It's going to be the developer edition, but to a client like Visual Studio, there's no obvious difference between Developer Edition and Full Edition. So what I want to do is right-click on SQL Server, say that I want to add another server that is out there somewhere. I know this one just happens to be on my local machine. So I'm going to select the name of my machine here, which is desktop-55DA34R. You can also put in a dot here. That always tells the SQL Server connectivity tools I want to connect to this machine that I'm already on. And yes, we're going to use the default authentication, which is going to be to use my Windows identity. And because I am an administrator on this machine, I should be able to connect to this database, which I did. And if I expand this out, I can see there are currently no databases. But ultimately, by the end of this module, I want to see the Ode to Food database as a database on this SQL Server instance. And I want to have my application running in Iis and pointed to this SQL Server instance, not the LocalDB instance. So in addition to SQL Server, you're also going to need Iis installed. So yes, typically in a real production web server, you'll have Iis installed on Windows Server. I'm not using Windows Server here for this machine. I'm using Windows 10 Professional. But you can install Iis on versions of Windows other than Windows Server. You just have to be very careful about the production licenses and how many concurrent connections are allowed. But for test and development, you can certainly install Iis into Windows, almost any edition. So I want to make sure that I have Iis installed on my machine. It's not going to be there by default. The easiest way to do that is to go to the Start menu, and I'm going to type for Features, do a search for Features, because the Control Panel component that I want to run is this one that allows me to turn Windows features on or off. I'm going to click to select that. This is where I can enable Windows features like containers. Do I want to work with Windows containers? Do I want to work with virtualization with Hyper-V? And also, do I want Internet Information Services, the web server? You'll want to make sure that you check this box and make sure you have at least the Iis Management Console selected. Now, inside of Worldwide Web Services, there's a few features that we need to make sure are enabled. You'll want to make sure that the features for static content, HTTP errors, directory browsing, and default document are enabled. That's going to make life easier with Iis. And I also want to make sure some of my application development features are enabled. I want to make sure, for example, that .NET Extensibility 4.8 is enabled, ASP.NET 4.8 is enabled. That's going to select a couple additional features by default that I'll need. What I don't need is the feature that allows me to run classic ASP. I don't need the CGI feature. I don't need server-side includes, but I really need all the features that will allow me to host an ASP.NET application. And once those features are selected, I'm going to press OK. Windows will spend some time downloading and installing various components. When this is done, it might require a reboot, but at the end of the process, I should have everything I need to run my ASP.NET application under Iis. Here we are, just after Windows has finished installing my new features and I've rebooted. I should now be able to open up the Start menu and search for Iis. What I want to look for is the Iis Manager. I want to open this application. It opens on a different monitor, so let me drag it over here to the screen where I am recording, and it is this application that allows me to manage the applications and services that are hosted on my machine. So if I expand Open Sites, I can see there's a single site currently that is hosted on my machine. So Iis can manage multiple applications and multiple services on a single machine. So I could host, let's say, 10 or 20 applications on this machine. It really depends on how large those applications are and how much CPU and memory I have on this machine. But this default website that comes by default It's going to be hosted on HTTP and on port 80. I can click here to browse that website. That will open up a browser that takes me to localhost, so no port number. We're going directly to port 80. And what I'm seeing is the default website that is managed by Internet Information Services. Our goal is to build out and publish Ode to Food. And when I come to localhost port 80, I will be looking at my application, Ode to Food. That's the point we want to get to. As I mentioned earlier, there's many different ways to publish a web application. We're going to use the Visual Studio approach. An alternative would be to use the tools that Visual Studio is using behind the scenes. So these are command line tools like MS Build and Web Deploy. Using those command line tools allows you to automate this publishing process. And that's what you need to do when you start working on a larger team or at a larger organization. I'm going to show you the Visual Studio approach. The way to do this in Visual Studio is to right-click on a web project and select the Publish option. The first thing I'll need to do is select my published target. So my published target could be an app service that is inside of Microsoft Azure. I can create a new app service here if I want to, or select an existing app service after I log in. I can also publish to a virtual machine that is inside of Azure. Again, all I need to do is browse to that virtual machine that I have created. And another option is to publish to Iis using either Web Deploy or File Transfer. So again, Web Deploy is a component of Iis. It's also a command line tool that I can use to publish an application. And you can think of Web Deploy as being the native tool that is used to publish into Iis. But not every scenario and not every environment is going to support Web Deploy, so another option is to use FTP or File Transfer Protocol, because ultimately, publishing a web application is all about copying all the needed files to the web server. And so in some scenarios, perhaps with older servers, all you really need is an FTP connection to move everything that you need from this computer to the web server. The approach that I'm going to show you is how to just publish to a folder. Because in a way, if I publish to Iis, that's just too easy. I just tell Visual Studio, publish to this Iis server, click on a few buttons, and it's finished. What I'm going to do is publish to a folder. Inside of that folder then will be all of the files that I need to run my application. And then I'll show you how to manually configure Iis to create a new website and point that website to my application. That will give you an idea of what's really happening behind the scenes when I do a full publish to Iis inside of Visual Studio. It also really gives you an idea of what's happening, the abstraction behind an Azure App Service, because if you select Azure App Service and use a Windows-based app service, that's really a platform where Azure manages Iis for you. But we're going to use this folder approach. So the first thing I have to do is choose the folder where I want to publish all the files for my application. By default, I will have a folder that is inside of where this project exists, but inside of the bin release publish folder, I'm going to select something different just to get it out of my source code directory. So I'm going to browse and I'm going to select a folder that I've already created on my C drive called web, but then I'm going to create a folder inside of there, and let's just call it Ode to Food. And that will be my destination. So C:\web\Ode to Food, you can select any folder that you like, and then I'm going to click publish. Visual Studio is going to go off and do a build and then also a publish operation, and this should finish very quickly because this is not a large application. There's not a lot to build and to copy around. And I can see down here in the output that I did succeed with my publish operation. I just want to point out that with this publish operation, we did a build in what we call release mode. That is, by default, when I created this web application, which is really a C# development project, there were two configurations given to me. There was the debug configuration and the release configuration. So far in this course, we've just left this at the default, which is to build and execute using a debug version of the application. When we publish this application, presumably we're taking it somewhere into production, so we want the configuration to be release mode. And there's a number of small differences there. For example, the C# compiler is going to run with more optimizations. But for the most part, I should be able to open this folder, and I can do that just by clicking on that. And inside of this folder, I will find all of the files that I need to run my application. So that includes files like in the bin folder, all the assemblies that I need to execute my application. So all of the DLL files, including odetofood.web.dll and odetofood.data.dll. I will also find inside of the views folder my razor views. So here inside of the restaurants folder, There's index.cshtml, which is essentially the homepage of my application. What will I not find in the published output? Well, if you look through these folders, you will not find a controllers folder. So there is no C# source code that is going to be included in the published output because all of the C# source code has been compiled into an assembly. So odafoo.web.dll or odafoo.data.dll. So those files are not needed, but my web.config file is needed. That's the configuration for my application. My views are needed, any script files, any content that I have, so static assets like bootstrap.css, all of that is placed into this folder, and I now have a folder that I can run my application from. Now that we have a release build of our application and all the files that we need published into a single location, let's take a look at setting up a new Iis website that will point to the application at this location. So let me come back to the Iis Manager, which we opened up earlier, and what I want to do is create a new website. It's also possible that you could add your application as a directory under the existing website, the default website, but I'm going to show you how to set up a brand new website. Now, if I want odafoo to respond to a request to this machine on port 80, then I'm going to need to do some reconfiguration because Iis already has a website configured to run on port 80, and that is the default website. If I right-click on this default website and go to Edit Bindings, what we'll find is that every website we add to this machine, because Iis on this machine can host multiple websites, it can host dozens of websites if they're small enough, but every website needs a unique binding that allows Iis to determine where to send an incoming request. If I have 10 different websites configured and running on this machine under Iis, and an HTTP request arrives, how does Iis know which of those 10 applications to send this request to? It's going to know because every website is going to need a unique binding. Every binding consists of a host name, a port, and an IP address. So if I have 10 different applications on this machine, I might differentiate them by having this machine reachable across 10 different IP addresses, and then I send a request for each of those 10 IP addresses to a dedicated application for that IP address. I can also use host name. So if I set up the right DNS entries, I could reach this machine as odafoo.com and odafoo.net and odafoo.org. So 3 different host names for this one machine, but I can also use the host name to tell Iis which website to route a particular request to. So this is almost like a form of routing that happens at the server level before we even get into our application and we route to a specific controller. But by far the easiest way to route, because I don't have to make any DNS changes, I don't have to make any networking changes, is just to route by port number. So if a request arrives at this machine for port 80, any host name, any IP address, that request is going to go to the default website. But if I want that request to go to my new odafoo application instead, I'm not going to be allowed to add 2 websites that both take messages over the same port without having a different IP address or a different host name. And since I'm not going to change the host name or the IP addresses, I'm going to need to change the port that the default website is listening on. I could also delete the default website. I could also replace the default website with odafoo, but I'm going to take this approach of just changing the port for the default website, so I'm not going to do anything destructive, and you don't have to do anything destructive on your machine. I'm just going to say that I want to change the port to port 81, select OK, and now if I come back into my browser, this website that used to respond to localhost port 80, if I do a hard refresh on this website, that website no longer exists, so I am unable to connect. However, if I go to port 81 and press enter, I have now moved that default website over to port 81. And now what I want to do is set up a new website that points to my odafoo application. So back in the Iis Manager, one way to add a website through this UI is to right-click, say that I want to add a website, and I can first give this site a friendly name. So let's just call this odafoo, so it's very obvious when I'm looking at my list of sites which one is odafoo, and then I specify a content directory. So I need to tell Iis where are all the files for this application. And all these files are going to live in that folder that we just created with the Visual Studio Publish operation. So keep in mind, if I use Visual Studio and I publish directly to Iis, these are some of the steps that Visual Studio will take care of for me but I wanted you to see these steps explicitly because it can help when you need to troubleshoot to understand what actually happened behind the scenes. So I'm going to configure the physical path to go to that web folder that we created and select the Ode to Food folder that is inside of that web folder and select OK. And at this point, Iis is smart enough to understand ASP.NET. It's smart enough to understand, oh, there's a bin folder in this location where I can load up assemblies for ASP.NET. And it understands it's going to be running that web application. We're going to have it start immediately. We're not going to change any of the binding information. So again, if I already had a website on port 80, I would either need to change the IP address that this website responds to, or change and provide a host name, or change the type. So I could bind HTTP to one website and HTTPS to another one, but we're just going to use regular HTTP traffic. And before I press OK, I just want to point out that Iis is going to create a new application pool for my application. This application pool name is going to be Ode to Food. What is an application pool? An application pool is the actual process that is going to be executing on this computer that will host the code that is executing for my application. So what Iis can do is put various websites into different application pools so they're somewhat isolated into different processes. That way, if my application pool crashes for some reason, Ode to Food crashes, I don't bring down any of the other application pools that might be running the other websites on this machine. Another important reason to understand what application pool you're a part of is if you need to know the identity that your web application is going to be using. So when your web application accesses files on this computer, or accesses resources on this computer, or goes to access, let's say, a database, what is the inherent identity that the application is going to have? The identity it's going to have is the same as the application pool. Now we'll see why this becomes important when I need my application to access a SQL Server database. But for right now, I'm just going to say, yes, let's create this new website. So I can now see Ode to Food in the list over here. And I should be able to come back to my web browser, and instead of going to port 81, which is the default website, let's go back to port 80, which is where Ode to Food lives, but I'm going to run into a bit of a problem. Eventually, I should see an error from my application. It just might take a little bit of time, but eventually my application is going to figure out that it cannot reach the database that I need. So the home page of the application is going to try and get a count of the number of restaurants that are in the application. But the database my application is configured to use, which is LocalDB, is not going to be accessible for my application when it's running under Iis. So again, there are ways to configure LocalDB to make that work, but what we want to do is have our application work with the Sql Server Developer edition that I installed. So finally, the application comes back and says, sorry, but there's a problem trying to establish a connection to SQL Server. The server was not found or not accessible. The server was not found. So let's look at how to configure this application to use the other instance of SQL Server that we have installed. Earlier in the course, we saw that we can use a special file in an ASP.NET project, the web.config file, to configure settings for our application, like a database connection string. And then when we published our application from Visual Studio, one of the files that Visual Studio will include in the publish operation is that web.config file. So if I look in the folder where I have published the application, so in the web/ode to food folder, I will find web.config, and you might think, well, this is now where I am running this application. This is where I pointed Iis when I said, set up a new website called Ode to Food. And so if I modify this web.config file here, that will make changes to the application that is running. And that is true. If I modify the connection string in this web.config file, I will change the database that my application is trying to reach. However, what you have to be careful about is application updates. What happens the next time someone publishes into the same folder? They're going to overwrite the changes I made in web.config with whatever changes are in Visual Studio currently. Now, there's various ways to manage and solve that problem. Let me show you one way to do this that is built into Visual Studio and ASP.NET. So if I come to my odetofood.web project, there is my web.config file, but notice I can expand this node, and there's actually two files that are hidden behind web.config, and that is web.debug.config and web.release.config. These are known as web.config transformation files. So these are transformations that Visual Studio will apply to web.config when it publishes web.config for a given configuration. In other words, if I publish this project in debug mode, I can add settings that are specific to debug mode inside of web.debug.config, and they will get applied to my web.config. Likewise, when I publish in release mode, I can add special instructions to web.release.config to make changes to the web.config that is published for my application. So if I want to consistently use the same database for my release mode production configuration, I can add an instruction into web.release.config to make sure that my production mode database is always the database in the connection string in the web.config that is produced. Let's open up web.release.config. What we're seeing is lots of comments to describe the capabilities of a web.config transformation file. And of course, there's going to be additional capabilities that I don't show you in this particular module. But what we're seeing here is an example of changing the connection string that is in web.config when I do a release mode publish operation. So all I need to do is uncomment this bit of code, and I will now be able to change a connection string that has the name mydb. So that's not the exact name that I want to change. If I come into web.config and look at the connection strings I have configured, the name that we decided to use was odfoo context. So I'm going to highlight that and press Ctrl+C to copy that, come over into web.release.config and paste that here. So in a release mode build and publish operation, I want to change a connection string named odfoo context, and I want to set it to the following connection string. That's what this transform is saying. It's saying go out and match an element by name in the regular web.config file, and then set the attributes on that particular element to match what is here. And now we just need to make a change to the connection string. So what is my data source? Well, instead of being localDB, I want to change my data source to be this machine. We've already seen that I can connect to this new instance of SQL Server that I have available, Sql Server Developer Edition, just by specifying a server name of dot. And then, what is the catalog that I want to use? Let's again use a database named odfoo. And finally, how do I want to connect? Well, I would like to use integrated security, but this can be a little bit tricky with Iis. So there's two different approaches that I can use to connect to my SQL Server. One is to create a user on my server and a login, so that when I specify a connection string, I can say that the username equals something, and that username is going to have a password. I'm not a big fan of usernames and passwords to access databases. Usernames and passwords have to go into configuration files, and configuration files all too often end up in source control, which is a problem when you publish your username and password. So instead, I am going to stick with integrated security, but now I need to make sure that SQL Server will accept a connection from the identity that my application is running with. And remember, my application is going to run in an app pool named odfoo. That's what we saw configured inside of Iis. And so I need to make sure that SQL Server will accept this odfoo Iis identity and will allow this identity to create a database, because that's what the entity framework is going to do when it arrives on that server and sees there is no odfoo database. Of course, in a real production environment, if you're working for a larger organization and a larger team, you can use tools with the entity framework to generate a script and use that script and pass it through a DBA to create the database. But my goal in the next clip is going to be to configure SQL Server to allow my application to connect and create a database odfoo with all the tables it needs. Before we get to the next clip, however, I also want to point out this other bit of transformation down here, which applies to the system.web compilation element, and this element that is commented out, which applies to custom errors. So it is a good idea to include this transformation that changes your custom errors. So I'm going to uncomment out that bit. And that is because what we're seeing from our application is typically not something that you want a user to see. So just to remind you, what we're currently seeing in the application is a very detailed error message that even includes a stack trace of exactly what happened inside of our application. This is not information that we want to give out to just anyone who's trying to use this application. This information is really intended for developers only. And with ASP.NET, there is a way to control what happens when there's an unhandled server error like this, and that is with the custom errors section. What we can do, instead of displaying that detailed error message that ASP.NET provides, is instead display some sort of friendly error page. So if I create an internal error.html file and use this bit of web.config transformation, I can show a friendlier error in production, something I want my everyday users to see when something goes wrong. So I'm going to leave this custom errors section in place. But now let's go configure our database to allow Ode to Food connections. We want to configure Sql Server Developer to allow a connection from our Ode to Food application that's running in Iis. In order to do that, let's go to the Sql Server Object Explorer, where we already have a connection established to the SQL Server that I want to change. And what we really want to do is add a new Sql Server Login. So the easiest way to do that is to come into Logins, right-click. I'm going to say that I want to add a new login, and Visual Studio will generate some SQL that I can execute to create a new login. Now this particular login, this particular command is the type of command that you would execute when you want to create a username and password type of login. That is not what I want to do. What I want to do is create a login that is based on an existing Windows identity. And the way to do that is to say that I want to create a login, specify the Windows identity that I want to use, and then tell SQL Server this identity is from Windows. But now I need to specify the exact login that I want to select from Windows. So what is the identity? In other words, here's one identity, which is desktop-some number / Scott. But what I need is the identity for my application pool. So coming back into the Iis Manager, I just want to show you, every application I create, Iis can set up what is known as an application pool, so that every application has a different identity. So the Ode to Food application pool, as long as this is set to application pool identity, it's going to have an identity that is unique to that application pool. So the identity for Ode to Food is different from the identity for the default app pool. And this is how you can separate and isolate applications. So any application running inside of the Ode to Food process, just because it's an Iis, it's not going to be able to access the same databases that might be in the default app pool, because they are going to have two different identities. So how do I specify this Ode to Food identity when I'm telling SQL Server about the login that I want to create? Well, the syntax for this is to say that you're creating a login whose name begins with Iis app pool / and then the name of the application pool. So in this case, the application pool name is Ode to Food. And what I want to do is execute that little bit of SQL. I can do that, I believe, with the shortcut key Shift-Control-E. I can also come up here under the SQL command and say execute. Yes, the shortcut is Shift-Control-E. I have now created that login. And now I just need to give this login some permissions so it can perform any activity that it needs. What I want to allow is I want to allow the entity framework to connect to the server and then create a database for me. So again, in other environments where you have DBAs and operation teams, you probably want to generate scripts for your database and execute them in a more controlled fashion. That's certainly possible with the entity framework. But again, for me, in this course, in this scenario, I'm more than happy with the entity framework creating the database for me, but I have to tell SQL Server that this Ode to Food login is allowed to create a database. And the way to do that with SQL Server is to issue a command to alter a server role. So there is a server role known as DB creator, and any logins that are in this role have the ability to create a database. And from that time forward, the login will be the owner of that particular database that it's created and will be able to perform any operation that it needs. It can write data, it can read data, it can create tables inside of that database. But I do need to tell SQL Server, please alter the server role DB creator. What I want to do is add another member into this role, and the member that I want to add is this login that I just created. So Iis app pool / Ode to Food. Let's again hit Control-Shift-E, and that command has completed successfully. So now I have a web.config file that tells my application to connect to the Sql Server Developer instance on this machine as Ode to Food with integrated security. And I've also told SQL Server about this login, so SQL Server should accept this login. Now all we need to do is republish the application to get those web.config changes in place and then retry the application. Inside of Visual Studio, I've saved all the files that need saving. Let me right-click on the project and I went to Publish. Notice the previous publish operation that we completed has saved into a profile. So anything that I configured about that publish operation, those settings have been saved. I can create new publish profiles. I can rename and delete publish profiles. So I might have several different publishing profiles associated with a project. One to publish into QA, and one to publish into production, and one to publish to a different server that I use for testing. We just have this single profile that we created earlier in this module. It was named folder profile. I should probably rename that, but let's just go ahead and publish again. This will just take a second as Visual Studio does another build and copies those files out again. If I come out to the file system, I should see that the timestamp for web.config is updated, and it is. Let's even just open that up with Visual Studio Code real quickly to take a peek. And if I bring Visual Studio Code over here, I can see my web.config transformation is working, because now my ode2foo DB context connection string is not pointing to local DB. Instead, it's pointed to the local instance that is running on this machine. So that's good. And now if I come over to my web browser, I'm hoping to be able to refresh the homepage of the application and see a response that doesn't involve an error message. It might take a moment to make this first connection and for the entity framework to set up the database for me, but I am back to the point where I have a running application and I have 0 restaurants in my database. So just to verify, let's open up Visual Studio, let's come to SQL Server Object Explorer, let's refresh the list of databases that are available, and there is ode2foo, and there is my restaurants table. So it looks like everything has been created properly and everything is operational. And now all I need are users who can come in and edit and add some new restaurants for me. And that brings us to the conclusion of this module and also of the course. I hope you enjoyed this course, and I hope it gives you everything that you need to develop with ASP.NET MVC. I hope you have many successful projects ahead of you. And I want to give you a sincere thank you for watching this course through to the end. Thank you.